So again, thank you for joining us this evening to hear from our Peace USA delegation reflecting on their experience at COP28 at the end of last year. Our presentation this evening is sponsored both by various offices of the Presbyterian Mission Agency and our friends at Presbyterians for Earth Care. We wanted to make a note to begin with that we do have Spanish interpretation available this evening, provided by Global Language Resources Ministry of the Administrative Services Group. To use that function, you can click the world icon that's located on the lower bar of your screen. You can select your preferred language to access the interpretation channel that you would need.
Muy buenas noches a todos y a todas. Mi nombre es Koball y para los español hablantes, para acceder a la interpretación, busquen la parte inferior de la página. Hay unos iconos ahí y haz clic en el icono que dice Interpretation o interpretación. Después de hacer clic, uno puede elegir el idioma que quieres escuchar. Entonces ahí debes elegir Spanish o español. Gracias.
Thank you, Jed. I am Jessica Maudlin. I am the Associate for Sustainable Living and Earth Care Concerns with the Presbyterian Hunger Program. And I got the great joy of organizing and working with our delegation as they were in Dubai this year. Excited to get to moderate the panel discussion with them this evening. So to give you a little bit of background, if you're not familiar, the first United Nations Conference on the Parties, which is what COP stands for, was held in Berlin in 1995. That gathering had 3,969 delegates. The official registration for attendance for COP28 this year was just under 100,000 people. So this is an event that in the 28 years that it has happened has really grown quite a bit. After COP happened, that was held this past December in Dubai, though COP adopts what's called a cover decision. The cover decision from Dubai will also be known as the UAE consensus. That cover decision really left folks deeply divided in terms of the assessment of if it was a successful COP or not. Folks that have this eye towards the fundamental causes of climate change. So what are the drivers and solutions for climate change? What are folks that have been tracking the long history of these negotiations saw this as a real landmark COP, and that it would be a catalyst for some of these changes that we have to make in order for us to have a fighting chance to cope with the impacts of climate change. On the other hand, communities who are already heavily impacted by the climate change that has happened, by the disasters that have happened, they were really looking for some concrete measures. They were looking for clear objectives and timelines and tangible support packages and clear means of implementation. And for some people, it really felt like that those concrete and tangible things were missing. The connection of the Peace USA to COP is that in addition to the Presbyterian ministry at the United Nations, the Peace USA has had a long history of making sure that we are a voice of faith community represented. You'll hear from someone tonight who has been to nearly every one of them and is such a great voice of wisdom. Some folks wonder why, as a denomination, that we send a delegation to COP, and you'll hear more from our panelists about their experience of that, but I just wanted to lift up kind of a broad assessment from our friends at the Interfaith Center for Sustainable Development. They shared that faith communities, particularly this year, were really at the heart of COP and were recognized for their role and the support and the powerful voice, moral voice that they are as faith communities in climate change work. They reported that as much as 7% of the total overall media coverage of COP this year referred to faith or faith-based organizations in some way. So the Presbyterian Church USA is really proud to be part of these voices of faith saying that we know that we need enhanced and immediate action and responses to jumpstart these transitions and to continue some transitions that are already happening in order to be able to protect island countries, lower lying nations that are really at risk for extinction if we don't get moving into tangible action. So I will now move to getting to hear some of the great stories that we have from our delegation. Joining us this evening, we have 4 folks. Alethia White, who is the co-regional liaison for Northern and Central Europe. We have Christina Cosby, who is the domestic policy representative in the Office of Public Witness in Washington, D.C. We also have Jed Koball, who is the Joining Hands Catalyst for Extractive Industries, Human Rights, and in the Environment. And lastly, we have the Reverend Bill Somplatsky-Jarman, who was a former staff member for the Presbyterian Committee on Mission Responsibility through Investing, and is also the regional representative on the Presbyterians for Earth Care Steering Committee. So we are grateful to have all of these wonderful folks with us. Thank you so much for being with us, presenters, and thank you for the sacrifice and the time that you took to make the trip to Dubai. We know that it was a really long one, so we're so thankful for that. We want to get started with a couple of questions, and I think that we are going to start with just a broad overview. If you could just take a few minutes and share with us what your overall impressions of COP were as a participant. I know that for some of you this was the first time, so we would love to hear just what those impressions were. Jed, I think that we can start with you.
Thanks, Jessica. Good evening, everyone. I'm Jed Koball. As Jessica mentioned, I'm the Joining Hands Catalyst for Extractive Industries, Human Rights, and the Environment, and I'm based in Lima, Peru, where I'm speaking to you from this evening. This was my first COP as a delegate, so on the inside, to be able to witness the negotiations. I had been at the previous COP28, which was held here in Lima, Peru, but I was on the outside of that one. So it was a very different experience, hardly a sacrifice. Yes, a long trip, but it felt, it was a privilege to be there. This COP got off to a less than auspicious start. We learned that just days leading into the COP that the Sultan Al-Jaber, who is the president of this COP, a state oil exec from United Arab Emirates, we learned he had been making backdoor negotiations for selling oil to other countries through the COP process. So we knew that this COP was going to be dominated by the presence of oil money and the power of oil, and that was on full display. From day one of the COP, that tension came to play in the opening comments. You had Sultan Al-Jaber talking about the role of fossil fuel and oil money in addressing climate change, saying you can't do any of it without our money. Basically, so let us keep making money and we can address the problem. And then you have the general executive of the UN, Antonio Guterres, saying, no, now's the time to phase out, absolute move away from fossil fuels. And so from day one, that was the tension that was overriding this whole COP: phase out or keep going forward with oil. For me, the whole fact that it was in Dubai was itself a display of the power of oil money. I mean, this city with tallest skyscrapers in the world, beautiful roads and infrastructure. The Expo City where it was held was a beautiful setting for the COP, all made with oil money. And that wasn't, of course, intentional, just to show how much oil money can do. But again, there was this presence of civil society, the church very much a part of it, saying, nope, it's phase out. That's the only way forward. It was not about phasing down, not reducing, it was total phase out of fossil fuels. That language got adopted, but to what extent, really? Because there was no real accountability, no timeline, no real commitments to phasing out. So some might argue that, and I would be one of them, who would argue that the oil industry got exactly what it wanted out of this COP. It gave the perception that it was being reasonable, but at the end of the day, it kept all of its power to keep doing what it's always been doing. And so that is kind of, I think that other tension, that feeling was kind of throughout this COP and coming out of the COP. It was very easy to walk away from it being cynical. There's a lot of rhetoric at play, the phase out. There was the creation of the loss and damages fund, which is to be celebrated, but no money is really put into that. So it's, again, more rhetoric, but where's the accountability? And so for me, yes, I heard the rhetoric. I felt the mistrust. I think a lot of people feeling, what's the point of this COP? If it's just the powers that be playing their wordsmithing games, but at the end of the day, no real content. And I heard all of that. I felt all of that, but I don't share necessarily the cynicism. I think our presence in particular as part of the larger ecumenical and interfaith body is really important at the COP. And I'd say for 3 reasons in particular that I felt and observed while there. One is simply to bear witness, to hold people accountable to what they say, the decisions that are being made, the voices of power that are speaking there. Bear witness to that. 2, to faithfully advocate through the processes that exist in the COP. And I think thanks to our Office of Public Witness, thanks to the larger ecumenical movement, the World Council of Churches, it was awesome to witness how people are deeply engaged in all the policy points that were being negotiated over a 2-week period of time. And I think that's important work that we need to continue to be doing. And the third reason, which was particularly moving for me and what I felt there, was the COP is a place to really build, continue to construct these multi-sector, multi-movement, interfaith coalitions to shape the change that's happening beyond the processes of the COP in order to effectively take the power back away from fossil fuels and get the power back to the people. And I felt that while I was there in all the civil society spaces. And then coming back to Peru, where I am now, in the aftermath, the weeks following the COP and in recent weeks now, that has been the predominant voice I'm hearing in the church here and in the civil society sector here and throughout South America, is the need to build bigger, broader coalitions led by marginalized and historically those and the peoples most historically harmed. In particular, looking forward, and from here in South America, looking forward to COP30, which will be in Brazil, and saying that has to be our historical moment to take power back, because right now the power is in the hands of the fossil fuel and oil companies. So how can we as a church be a part of that process of building those coalitions and taking power back to the people? So I think I have a lot of hope and excitement coming out of COP28, and for me, looking forward to COP30 about 2 years down the road. So that's kind of my broad overview of my experience.
Thank you so much for sharing, Jed.
Hi, everyone. My name is Alethia White, and usually I'm based in Berlin, Germany, but for the last few months, we've been in the United States on the East Coast. And so I flew from the East Coast to Dubai. It is a long trip, certainly longer than going to Europe, but definitely well worth it, as Jed expressed. And it's fun already to see the pictures of my fellow delegates and to remember our time there, because as Jed already said, there was a lot to take in and a lot to digest and a lot to sort of redigest upon our return, and that we're still, I think, working through and thinking through together. I wanted to try to give you just a little bit of the sense, I guess, from my perspective of the atmosphere at the COP. And it's difficult to truly express that atmosphere, I think, because of the sheer size and also the interests that were represented were just so diverse. There were so many different projects that you could learn about. Of course, there were the negotiations to follow. There were just so many different levels, I think, or layers going on there in those 2 weeks. It was really, really good to be embedded in the ecumenical interfaith delegation and to learn from the team that we were particularly working with, and to support them where possible and just make those connections and feel that we were really part of a larger movement that was, as Jed said, getting a lot of positive attention. And I think that's really the direction that we as faith communities should be going in, working together on some of these big, big issues. I wanted to point out just a few things from these photos. The venue itself was really, I must say, a pleasant place to be. And as Jed noted already, the architecture in Dubai is pretty incredible, and it was definitely showed off a bit in this venue. It was very nice actually, and made quite an impression. There's a picture here of in this coffee shop. You can see the Powered by Women sign on the red wall in the background. Christina and I are here in the foreground. And what I like about this picture is there are a couple things going on. One, this coffee shop was pretty central, and it was really a meeting space for lots of people in between sessions, a place to kind of gather before organizing demonstrations, a place to meet other people and discuss together. You can see the people right behind us in line, they're both on their phones. And that to me is just so the picture of moving through the COP. Everyone is holding their phone up to their face, following the negotiations, sending messages to their team, or making notes or whatever. It's just everyone really glued to their phone and operating in that way. It made an impression on me. And also in the background here is the COP president, who Jed talked about a bit. And this was really like a photo op for him, I think. Christine and I happened to be there at the same time, and there were, you can't see, but to the right of that photo were just lots of cameras and reporters following him as he was talking with this perhaps minister, I'm not sure who she was, and ordering a coffee. So that was kind of an interesting moment of lots of different worlds colliding. There were lots of demonstrations taking place, and they were taking place in sort of a controlled manner, but they were still there. And I think this one that this photo is, it says ceasefire on one of the signs, and it also says climate decolonialization on the other. And they were really combining those two issues. The ceasefire, of course, referring to Palestine. And it was really interesting to me to be at this COP while there were also some significant global events happening at the same time that no one could really ignore. So what was happening in the Middle East was definitely noted at the COP, but also connected to climate issues in terms of what damage is done to the environment during a wartime. What are the results of that? And so I was happy to see that came out in some of the demonstrations. And then this last picture is me at an event that took place at the end of my time there. I went to hear Bassem Youssef, who is really very well known in Egypt especially, but he now lives in the United States. And he does sort of a form of political comedy, and not unlike Jon Stewart. He's sometimes called the Jon Stewart of the Middle East. And he was there. And what I like about that experience was that I was sitting there for some time waiting for him to start and looking out at the audience around me and just noting how diverse it was. It was really people from all over. And I think that for me was really the hopeful part about the COP atmosphere was, as Jessica noted, there were nearly 100,000 people there, which is, a percentage of the world population. But because we were coming from all over and we were all really there to focus on this subject of climate change, it felt hopeful in that sense. it was like a microcosm of the globe, I think, of what it could be. So I enjoyed that hope. And I also enjoyed that Bassem Youssef really used his time to address both the cynicism and the hope of being at a COP. I think he gave voice to what everyone was feeling, which was sometimes frustration, anxiety, hopefulness, energy, motivation. He really just sort of addressed it all in a funny way. It made all of us laugh, even though we're coming from all different parts of the globe and cultures. So thank you.
Thanks for sharing. And next we have Bill, who is our long-term COP attender.
Well, thank you. It was great to be with you this afternoon. As Christina and others have mentioned, I've been to a bunch of these things, and I think that part of what we don't realize is that if you look back over the time, there is so much more participation by global, citizenry now than there has been in the past. One of the contributions of the faith-based community has been to try to diversify the number of voices that are participating at COPs. And we've always had a very strong, diverse ecumenical delegations from the World Council of Churches and from U.S. churches. Now, if you go there, the presence of young people, indigenous people, and the strengthening of the delegations from many of the poorer countries, least developed and lesser developed, have various kinds of categories, is amazing. In the past, they've all had to kind of like pool their resources to have just a few negotiators, and now they have broad participation throughout the COPs. I think the other thing which was really amazing too is that the growth of the presence of faith-based representatives. This all dates back to the time of the Earth Summit in Rio in 1992. And at that point, they laid out a bunch of sustainable development goals and named key constituencies that should be involved in solving these problems. They would be like farmers and women and workers and business, environmental groups, et cetera, were all named in the final thing. The one thing that was not named was the faith-based communities. And yet our presence has tried to give voice and amplify the voice of those who have been left out. And I think we've done a pretty good job of it. We now have a liaison committee for the faith-based communities with the UN. And we made, there was significant participation of key constituents this time. So on that score, I take a lot of hope. I like to walk through the exhibit places and talk to the young folks, and many of whom are studying climate science and other aspects of the issues, and to see the breadth of their knowledge, their commitment, and all that gives me a lot of hope for the future. So that's my main contribution right now. I'll be glad to chime in a little more later. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Will you tell us about your encounter with Vice President Gore? I heard that was a great story.
Yes, so Vice President Gore was there, as were a number of other, as you might say, celebrities, Hillary Clinton, King George, and others. A lot of people don't realize the historic role that Al Gore played in helping the faith communities really get off the ground in terms of climate advocacy. He was key to helping to pull together a gathering in DC way back in the early 90s where the National Religious Partnership for the Environment was launched. And I'm sure he doesn't remember it, but I did get to sit next to him at a dinner at that point. And over the years, he has tried to educate and help church folk and other faith-based individuals become more articulate about climate and to figure out how to get organized at the local level. So I've had several encounters with him, and this one just happened to be by fluke. But it was good to see that he's still kicking, you know. So that was yeah.
That's great. Thank you. And last but not least, Christina.
Thank you, Jessica. I joined the delegation to COP28 later on in the planning process, so closer to October, and leaving about a month later. And I was struck by the question, as my co-journeyers and colleagues, and maybe some of you on this call have wondered, what does the church have to do at COP and with climate change? And I was brought back to the Matthew 25 mission and vision of the PCUSA, which many of us know so well. But there's three main foci: eradicating systemic poverty, dismantling racism, and building congregational vitality. And we acknowledge interwoven and interspersed among those are three priorities: climate change, heteropatriarchy, and militarism. And COP28 really brought to life for me the ways that climate change truly is interwoven and intersects with all aspects of our lives to create a wholeness and a wellness for both planet and people. The COP28 venue, as these pictures show and many of my colleagues have shared, was expansive. It was 400 hectares to be exact. And across the sweeping landscape, there were meeting rooms and auditoriums, large high-level meetings and plenary sessions for the many delegates and negotiators and observers to gather in. And there were also these areas called pavilions. Each country had a pavilion, such as the US or Peru or Germany or Brazil. On Bill's slide earlier, we saw us visit the State of Palestine's pavilion. And then there were topical pavilions and hubs: women and gender, a creation hub, a technology and AI hub, a faith pavilion, which we will talk more about later on in the evening. But walking these sidewalks from place to place, you really could see how climate change intersects with all of our lives. And then secondly, I often get asked the question at the Office of Public Witness, where do you find hope in turbulent and treacherous times? And I think that's especially important question when we sit with climate change and the effects of our warming atmosphere. Mark Iaconelli, in a recent presentation, answered a similar question with the response that he finds hope on the go. And we've heard Alethia talk about how people were glued to their phones in coffee shops and on sidewalks and in presentations. But at COP28, it was the globe converged in one place. And hope really was on the go, from meeting to meeting, from coffee break to coffee break, from side conversation to high-level meetings. Hope was in that place, converged as we all came together from around God's globe. And it was on the go in the midst of this busy and hectic time. And so I will end there for now, but yeah, thank you all for being here.
Thank you, all four of you, for sharing. I have a couple of questions specifically for some of you. Alethia, you shared about this experience of sitting amongst such a diverse crowd of people and what it was like to be one amongst this 100,000 crowd. One of the criticisms or pushbacks that COP gets relates to its relevance and efficacy compared to the thousands of people using carbon to fly to get to the COP. And so that's a question worth pondering. And so I guess now for you, having attended, I'm curious what your thoughts are on COP, why it's important as a denomination that we're there, and how you feel that might inform your work with partners, particularly in your role as the regional liaison.
Thanks for that question, Jessica. I really like this question actually because I asked it myself when I was considering whether or not to go, because it is so far. And I asked that question of myself a lot actually for most things that require travel. And I remember there was a day where Jed and I happened to get into a press conference that was otherwise relatively closed. And that exact question was posed actually during the press conference. Is it justifiable to travel here given the carbon output? And I remember that the answer was a resounding yes. It's definitely worth it, because if you're not showing up in these spaces, then you don't have really the voice. Actually, you need to be in these spaces. You need to be part of these things. And I have to agree with that. I think that the carbon, toll on the environment for events like this is, I hope, relatively small in comparison to the potential benefits or outputs that come from these discussions. And that was also echoed during this press conference, that same sentiment. So I think that it is definitely worth it. I still pick and choose what I travel to, or how I travel to events actually. But I also think that showing up and being there is extremely important, especially now there's a sense of sort of extreme urgency. And that's just growing. And I have to say, as regional liaison in my little region, so Northern and Central Europe, I've noticed for years actually that the partners that the PCOSA relates to are very concerned with these issues regarding climate issues, climate change. And I, in the past, took part in different platforms or networks in Europe that are related to environmental concerns that are faith-based, actually. And I always personally and professionally have been really concerned with these issues. That goes back a long time, my personal interest in that. So I could participate to an extent, of course, with partners and networks that were related to environmental issues, but now in the last year especially, and now having been to the COP, I feel that I have a much better place to stand in relationship to those partners and in those discussions. Because for the European partners, climate change is not unrelated to these other issues that we are all working on in terms of migration, racism, militarism, you name it. Actually, I think climate change is wrapped up in all of those. So to care about one of those issues is like, you cannot not care about climate change. For me, I was also really struck during the COP exactly about that issue, the interrelatedness of some of these issues and how that was discussed within the faith community. And I think also in our area office, I wanted to note, because Christina brought it up, these different foci that we have as a denomination, that in our small, there's not so many of us in our area. It's the Europe and the Middle East office. We each try to really be involved in one of those issues. So for me, climate change has become that issue over the last couple of years, and now I feel I have a much stronger base on which to stand with partners. And also just to note that there are so many partners around the world that are involved in these issues, and the PCOSA really, it has been as well, but I think it takes all of our efforts. So it's important that we're in there together.
Absolutely. I want to turn now to Bill. We heard you talk a little bit about one of the changes over the years is the number of people involved. But I'd love to hear thoughts that you have about how this COP felt different from others in the past. I know I saw one report that said that there were 2,400 fossil fuel lobbyists compared to only just over 1,600 delegates from the 10 most climate vulnerable countries. Have you seen that type of thing grow over the years? Does it feel like that the presence of fossil fuel lobbyists are more real? Are there other changes that you've noted over the years? We'd love to hear a little more about that. Oh, you are muted. If you could unmute yourself.
Thank you. Sure, I'd be glad to. I think that a couple of things about this. One is the fossil fuel industry has been there from the very beginning, and not in the numbers that you see now, but they formed little groups with odd names. But when you scratch deeply, you find the fossil fuel industry, and they have had a somewhat of an influence. Most of their influence, I think, is done before we ever get to the COP. So that's very true. There are other business entities there that are more amenable toward sustainability, and they have also grown in their importance and numbers. The biggest part of it is that in the past, we have not had as strong or numerous voices of civil society that has countered all this. And I think that while the numbers are big this year, and they will be again next year when we're in Azerbaijan, which is another oil country, I think that we're able to pinpoint what they do and what they lobby. There's a lot of in the last couple of times, nuclear industry has been present as trying to tout themselves as a salvation of everything. We've over time worked with other business entities, banks, etc. And I think we've made some inroads in getting companies to make a commitment to utilize renewable energy, or to defund some of the other problematic loans that they were making. They were also, you'll find, trying to set building codes for new construction at the highest amount of energy efficiency, etc. So there have been some positive steps in that regard. I would say that the other thing is that in the past, you probably, like I had mentioned before, you had very small participation from the least developed countries. Now their delegations have been strengthened, their voices are heard. They've formed alliances which make them a stronger presence, and that's been a good thing. I think that's going to only strengthen in the future. Part of what we tried to do and we watched happen was to see whether or not the commitment to try as a goal to keep warming down to 1.5 degrees Celsius, and that succeeded in being kept in the forefront. So the COP this time had the first stock take since the COP was held in Paris, which committed everyone to try to reach what we needed to do in reductions in order to keep within the 1.5 degree goal. And that was good. So it was now we just have to find all the money to fund it. So
that is a great place for me to ask Christina to jump into the conversation and talk to us a little bit about that first global stock take. For those of you that maybe aren't familiar, it was sort of the report card, like Bill mentioned, about the progress that's been made towards keeping to that 1.5 goal. So Christina, can you add to that? Tell us a little more about how it fared at COP.
Sure. Thank you, Jessica, for the question, and Bill for the perfect segue. And I will also share a little bit more details on what the Paris Agreement is for some of us who it may have been a while ago that it came to the top of our forefront, or is new to us altogether. But the Paris Agreement was developed in 2015 at COP21, and its central aim is to strengthen the global response to the threat of climate change by keeping a global temperature rise this century well below 2 degrees Celsius, above pre-industry levels, which rough dates for pre-industry levels are 1850 to 1901, and to pursue efforts to limit the temperature increase even further to 1.5 degrees Celsius. The global stocktake is the central element used to evaluate these goals of the Paris Agreements and looks at the collective progress parties have made to achieve these goals. Jessica so kindly put it as a report card of sorts. The outcome of this first global stocktake aims to underpin further collective action before the next report is due in 2025. A preliminary report released earlier last year, October 2023, noted efforts are falling short. The report is comprised of 3 elements: adaptation, mitigation, and means of implementation and support. Adaptation refers to the changes in process and practices and structures that moderate loss and damage, or possibly benefits at times from climate change. Mitigation reduces the flow and heat trapping of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And the implementation of means refers to everything from climate technologies to climate finance. How do we implement these practices in an accessible and equitable way to all peoples, regardless of their age, gender, or race? The first stocktake, as we've mentioned, as other colleagues have alluded to, did not meet the anticipated marks. But with our actions and advocacy alongside recommitted and heightened U.S. commitment, we can limit the rising temperatures of our planets. And I would also like to note that the first stocktake, and maybe like Jed and others as we dive into our conversation deeper can mention this, did note that developing and indigenous communities are some of the best at reaching adaptation goals. And so we have a lot to learn from those communities and to lean on. So I'll turn it back over to you, Jessica.
Yeah, thank you, which sets us up perfectly. Our next question is for Jed, and I see there was a question raised about Indigenous communities in the chat, and Jed has provided some information there. A question I specifically had, Anne Rasmussen, who represents the Alliance of Small Island States, stood up and told the final COP28 plenary that in terms of safeguarding that 1.5 degree goal in a meaningful way, that the language of the consensus was a good step forward, but it didn't speak specifically to the fossil fuel phase out and mitigation, and that being done in a way that doesn't let people get through loopholes, and that those loopholes are a major concern for this alliance of small island states. I know that from your work that you were particularly interested in what was happening in regards to the voices of Indigenous people. And so I'd love to hear any thoughts that you might have about Anne's comments, or if anything, how that resonates with the people that you're working with, or anything that you hear from our partners in South America.
Thanks, Jessica. Yeah, I would say Anne's comments ring true for a lot of folks that I'm in relationship with here in South America, and folks I met with at the COP. For a number of years, I think there's this sentiment that's really been coming out of the Amazon rainforest that says if you want to solve the climate crisis, listen to Indigenous peoples. And that was really one of my primary motivations for being at the COP, was to listen to those voices in particular. I think for much of the climate justice movement, from the West or the North, the climate crisis is largely seen as a political, financial, and technological crisis. The political will, the money to be able to transition from fossil fuels to renewable energies. But I think for large portions of the world, and in particular Indigenous peoples, it's much broader and much deeper, the crisis, and many would say it's at its heart a spiritual crisis. And in fact, a spiritual crisis for which the church actually has a lot of responsibility for. In this way, and in fact, I think what Indigenous peoples, many are saying is that the climate crisis is a product of what we call an extractive economy. So an economy that's based off of seeing the earth as this object for creating wealth. So you take the earth, you claim it as your own, you dig it up, you tear it up, and you just produce stuff out of it. And all this waste is laid aside, people are pushed off their land, et cetera. That's the essence of an extractive-based economy, which began with really on full scale, global scale, with the European conquest and colonization, going back more than 500 years ago. So I think some would say the climate crisis began long before the Industrial Revolution. It began really with the colonization by Europe of much of the rest of the world, and the colonization that the church authorized and benefited from. So to address the climate crisis, we have to do this work of decolonizing, this global economy and moving towards what Indigenous folks might say is a post-extractive economy. So it's an economy that is about being in relationship with the earth, as our fellow living creature, which is sacred. And this is a challenge, even for progressive climate justice activists, because it presents a real problem for this transition from fossil fuels to renewable energies, because all those renewable energies require a whole new infrastructure and technologies that require a whole lot of mining. And we know that of all the critical minerals that are needed for this whole new infrastructure, more than half of them are on Indigenous lands. So what a lot of Indigenous folks are advocating for is, one, yes, total phase out of fossil fuels, leave it all in the ground, leave the oil in the ground, protect the rainforest and all biodiversity. So Indigenous peoples of the world protect, have 87% of all the biodiversity in the world is found on Indigenous lands. And we need that for the carbon sequestration and for the health of the planet. And then they're also talking about preventing the recolonizing of their land, by this transition to renewable energies, in the so-called green economy that is going to require digging up and destroying a whole lot of land so that we can effectively continue a certain lifestyle that we like in the West and in the North, to be quite frank. So the voice of Indigenous peoples at the COPs, from my understanding, is relatively new in terms of having this space for Indigenous peoples, their own pavilion. I think it's only been around for a couple of years. Bill might be able to speak to that more specifically. And in Dubai, it was relatively small, and I think in part because it was so far away, and Dubai is very expensive. So I don't think a lot of Indigenous movements could actually afford to be there. And in part, that's why they're looking towards the COP30 in Brazil to have a massive showing of Indigenous voices, but they want to have that cross sectors and with other movements of the world that are about this sort of decolonizing, which I think for me is at the heart of the whole Matthew 25 movement. It's about decolonizing the world in which we live. And so I think that's the hope of Indigenous peoples looking towards the COP30s, bring together these movements, these decolonizing movements, and show up in full force at the COP30 and try to alter the trajectory of where I think many feel these conversations are going at the COP, which many say is just rhetoric, but they keep showing up because it's an important space, and that's why we need to keep showing up, because it is an important space to connect with those folks, to lift up those voices. So I don't know if that exactly answers your question, but I do think Anne's comments ring true. There was a lot of rhetoric per se, some right words, but no content behind them. In order to get some content, we need a massive showing of people united, a global massive showing of people at a future COP. So,
gotcha. No, I think that was really helpful. I did have a few more questions, but we are down to about 10 minutes, and I see there are some questions in the chat. So if other folks have questions while we're addressing these two, you can put them in the chat. We'll try to get to them. We want to honor people's time, so we know if you need to get off at the hour mark, please feel free to. If we're still going, we might try to finish wrapping up a couple of questions. The two questions in the chat, to me, I thought Bill could probably speak best to, but it looks like he may have been, maybe there's a connection problem, but I see two questions immediately about how are the host cities determined? And then the other question is, do all delegates get to vote? I'm not sure if any of our panelists want to speak to that. If not, I can try to, but I'd love to hear if any of you want to speak to that. I'm going to open the floor for that. So my understanding is that the host cities are determined, so the world is broken up by regions, and the COP is rotated through the different region areas, and different countries get to act as the host, is kind of the basic answer of that. I know, I forget what year it was, but sometimes there are things that happen that a country could act as the host, but it may have to happen in a different location due to weather or other disaster issues. I see there's another question about do all delegates get to vote? And there are, I believe it's 195, it might be 197 member states. Is it 197, Christina?
Yeah, 195 to 199 is the numbers I saw.
Yeah, so those member states are the parties to the COP, and each of those countries gets to send delegates, and those delegates and negotiators do have the vote of that country. So for example, some of the indigenous groups or the faith organizations that are there with pavilions representing different interests, they can, depending on what zone they have access to, they can speak to the negotiators and let them know that eyes are on them about these decisions, but those groups don't necessarily get a vote. It's the member parties, delegates get to vote. The next question, yes, a recording. I'm recording. It will be made available. You will probably get an email from me tomorrow. And if there are, I can share the panelists' email addresses. And if there are specific questions for them, I'm sure they will answer those. It looks like Bill might be, if Bill is back with us, he might be able to speak to, there's a question about, is there actual cross-pollination occurring at COP between corporate concerns and non-extractive thinking folks? And I think you're muted, Bill.
You repeat corporate concerns and non-extractive
thinking folks. So non-extractive thinking folks. So I'm not sure, Elizabeth, if you can clarify what you mean by non-extractive thinking folks for us. And perhaps while she is maybe clarifying that question, what languages were used and were there translations in several languages was a question. So I don't know if any of you want to speak to that.
Yeah, the languages are translated like into the UN, and basically 5 different languages. And we also, like at the pavilion for indigenous people, they would bring translators who could translate from the native indigenous languages into English or Spanish or whatever. So those venues were small enough to that wasn't too hard to do. But in the big plenaries and all, it's the UN system of the 5 languages. So.
Thank you. Nettie raises again what I think Jed shared about, that this was the first time that there was an official faith pavilion. And while there was definitely a cost to that, it was also a great space. Do any of you have any reflections that you would like to share on having that faith pavilion space at this COP?
Sure, I'll start and let others jump in, and I'll try to interweave that into some of the ecumenical questions and interfaith questions that are in the chat. But this year was the first COP that had a faith pavilion present. It was donated by the COP presidency and operated by the Muslim Council of Women or Elders. And so that was a great space for the faith community and interreligious community to gather, to host panels, to have conversations. You notice that 4 of us were present in person from the Presbyterian Church, but we are part of a much larger coalition, part of the World Council of Churches and ACT Alliance, who are our ecumenical partners on this journey, because our advocacy is always done best when we work with others. So the 4 of us multiplied into countless others. I don't know the exact number. I wish I did, but maybe Jessica can get that later for us, or might know that. But the Faith Pavilion held panel discussions. One that stuck with me and still resonates in my heart was one from a 12-year-old special envoy from India who reminded faith leaders the magic, and that's the word she used, of our words and actions, and that we are the heroes of her fairy tales. And so I think so often we think of big actions we can do, but forget how much our words and simple day in and day out actions make a difference. So there was a faith pavilion and there was a large faith presence, and Jessica lifted up earlier that 7% of the media coverage mentioned or referenced or talked about a perspective of faith, which is all new to this COP28.
I can also just add that I was recently on a follow-up meeting with some ACT Alliance people who were part of that ecumenical delegation, and the discussion came up about the Faith Pavilion, which they were happy, we were all happy to have there. But it's unlikely, I think, that there would be one funded at the next COP or the one after, who knows? But the question was, what is the role of the faith community at COP, and does it need an actual structure, or it's more than activities in a pavilion, which was nice, but how do we as the faith community come forward if we don't have an actual structure? What is our presence? And I think there were a lot of inspiring conversations that came out of that at this particular meeting. So it's just sort of beginning, but I think that the presence of an actual faith pavilion, at least in this group, was great. But I think it just was like a catalyst going forward, sort of motivating their work together.
See, in the past, the faith community has gathered, there's meeting rooms, we always get together. We've sponsored side events, sometimes by ourselves and some in collaboration with other organizations. We have had a worship service on the in the intermeeting weekend. This year, we were blessed to have the new General Secretary of the World Council of Churches come and spend a whole week at the COP and meeting people and conveying our commitment to justice as a lens from which we view all of the work that we are doing. So we'll probably have to go back to something similar to that. The other thing which many of you probably would not be aware of is that because the COP was in the United Arab Emirates in Dubai, there is what they call a religious complex or a church complex, and that's not a psychological term. It's geographic, and that there's a small section of the city set aside where all the churches are operate and all, and quite a bit of activity goes on a day-to-day basis, and we interfaced with the clergy and lay leadership of several of those places, and met there twice and had worship services and elsewhere. So that was we also did that when we were in Doha a number of years ago, and that's just the way church has to operate in a predominantly Islamic country. So.
Well, and another piece of interfaith happenings, the Talanoa dialogues that have happened the last 2 years, has also been another place to bring faith communities together and to be able to release a statement of unity for positions of the faith community, that I think is important too. So we are just past time. I know there were a couple of questions in the chat that we didn't get to. If I can find answers for you, I will include those in my email to you, but we will definitely send out the email with the recording link. And if you, any last words from anyone on our panel before we go?
Go ahead,
Very
Jed.
quick response to a couple of questions about, we didn't really reference governments and their policies. I would say that's true. I think it's a keen insight. I would say that one theme, though, that was present at the COP was the role of local governments in particular, city governments especially, and how a lot of great policy works actually happens at the very local level. And I think that's a place where Presbyterians can plug in as well with their local governments. There was a question too about, oh shoot, I'm sorry, I already forgot it, but it was, I'll listen with that because I forgot what the other question was, sorry.
Was it decolonizing movements?
That could have been it, yeah. I think decolonizing movements, there's looking at historical harms. And the loss and damages also comes to this. That was the other question. I think people who have been historically harmed through colonization and continue to be harmed to this very day because of the structures that have been put in place going back hundreds of years. So there are movements, throughout the US and around the world to try to take apart all that colonization did from different vantage points. And so we as a church, how do we come alongside those movements? I think the Loss and Damages Fund speaks to that as well. That ultimately is about reparations. So we're looking at the peoples and countries who are most impacted by climate change are the ones who have least to do with causing climate change. And so, can we have conversations about what we owe them? The countries who cause this problem, we owe those who are suffering the most from natural disasters of many kinds. I think we as a church might want to have a conversation too. We give a lot from our heart, through PDA. We do some great work in response to natural disasters, but we often talk about it as in terms of our charity and our heartful giving. What it is that we should celebrate that. But might we also have a conversation about, this may be something we actually owe other people because we've played a big part in creating climate change, and now others are suffering tremendously because of it. Maybe it's a debt we owe as well. So those are hard questions to follow, hard note to end on, but I'll end there.
I'm just smiling because during our time in Dubai, I really learned so much from my fellow delegates, and I just love always hearing everyone's perspective and insight. So thank you so much for hosting this space and for joining us this evening that we could share a bit. It's been really great.
Yeah, thank you all again. I will say I will include links to mission coworker letters, both for Alethia and for Jed. I'll also include some links to some of the coverage that we did on our blog about COP, and if you want to read any more of those stories, and the recording. Christina, did I cut you off? Did you have one?
No, you're good. I want to acknowledge that we're talking about COP28, and that is a thing that happened last year in 2023, but COP is not a one event. It happens all year. Coming up this Thursday, the Ecumenical Act Alliance is meeting to plan for our future engagement. And so it is important as we leave this space, if you've heard things that are interesting, encouraging, or disappointing, that you also work within your cities and with your Congress representatives and Senate to build those relationships and let them know how you would like the US to be present, because it's not a one event, even though we so often talk about it in that manner. It happens all year long, and starts with the fiscal year 2024 budget, which Congress is still negotiating. So it's important for them to hear from you.
Thank you for that. That's a great place to end on, that we constantly here at home have work that we can be doing, and that's a great reminder. So blessings to the panelists, blessings to all of you that joined us. We thank you so much for your time and your interest, and we hope that you have a wonderful evening.